They found the body at 05:47 hours, face down in 8 inches of water, still wearing full combat gear. The training pool's surface was mirror flat, reflecting the pre-dawn gray of a sky that hadn't yet decided whether to mourn. Petty Officer Second Class David Halverson had been 22 years old, 3 weeks from completing his SEAL qualification. And according to the official report filed 6 hours later, he had panicked during a routine underwater drill and drowned before safety personnel could intervene. His godfather, Master Chief Duncan Halverson, stood at the pool's edge long after they'd removed the body, staring at that still water like it might give up its secrets if he waited long enough. He was 68 years old, a veteran of Desert Storm and 2 decades of training the Navy's most elite warriors, and he knew panic when he saw it. He also knew what a choke mark looked like on a young man's throat, even after submersion, even after the medics had done their work, even after the photographs had been taken and filed away in folders that would never see sunlight again. The bruising was faint, almost dismissible, the kind that could be explained away as equipment friction or the natural discoloration that came with drowning. But Halverson had spent 40 years learning to read bodies the way other men read books, and he knew the difference between incidental marking and deliberate pressure. The pattern was too symmetrical, too consistent with forearm compression, too much like the training holds he'd taught to thousands of students over the decades. He said nothing. Not then, not when they asked him to confirm the identity, and he looked down at his godson's waterlogged face and felt something crack inside his chest that would never properly heal. Not when they handed him the personal effects in a manila envelope that smelled like chlorine and bureaucracy, David's dog tags clinking against his phone and wallet like small bells tolling. He just nodded once, signed where they told him to sign, and walked away with his silence intact and his rage building like pressure behind a dam. That was 18 months ago. And in those 18 months, 2 more bodies had been added to the count. 2 more families had received folded flags and official condolences. And Master Chief Halverson had spent every single day knowing that his godson's death wasn't an accident and being unable to prove it to anyone who had the power to do something about it. The steel door of the combat training annex hissed shut behind Lieutenant Commander Elara Voss at 06:15 on a Tuesday morning in late September, sealing her inside a world that operated by rules written in sweat and unspoken hierarchies. No welcome committee, no ceremony, just the hollow echo of her boots on concrete and the thin rattle of chain-link fencing from the open-air mezzanine 3 stories above. The air tasted like rubber mats and old coffee, and the particular kind of testosterone that accumulated in spaces where men measured each other by how hard they could hit and how long they could endure. She didn't flinch. She never did. 28 years old, 5'7", lean as a whip and twice as tough, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a regulation braid and eyes the color of winter steel. No ribbons on her chest, no trident, just clean tan fatigues, the subdued silver oak leaf of a lieutenant commander catching the fluorescent light like a whisper of authority in a place where authority had to be earned the hard way, and a canvas duffel bag slung over one shoulder that contained everything she officially needed for this assignment. The unofficial items, the ones that mattered, were already in place. The encrypted tablet locked in her quarters with software that would alert her if anyone tried to access it. The direct line to the Inspector General's office that bypassed every link in the local chain of command, routed through servers in 3 different states to prevent interception. The classified file containing 3 autopsy reports, 2 internal complaints that had been buried so deep they'd almost disappeared entirely, and an authorization letter signed by someone 3 ranks above anyone in this facility that gave her access to everything except the one thing she actually wanted, which was the truth. She'd spent 6 years as a Navy combat medic before lateral transferring to the SEAL instructor program, a move that had raised eyebrows among people who didn't understand that teaching required understanding trauma at a level most instructors never achieved. 2 tours in Afghanistan, mostly medevac operations, pulling broken bodies out of burning vehicles and keeping them breathing long enough to see a hospital. She knew what training injuries looked like, the clean breaks and controlled contusions that came from pushing limits in supervised environments. She knew what combat injuries looked like, the chaos and randomness of shrapnel and bullets. And she knew, with the cold certainty of someone who'd seen her younger brother carried out of Fort Benning in a body bag after a bayonet drill went wrong, what murder disguised as an accident looked like. Michael Voss had been 20 years old, an Army Ranger candidate with a bright future and the kind of determination that made instructors either love him or hate him, depending on whether they valued persistence or mistook it for insubordination. The official report said he'd failed to properly execute a defensive maneuver during live bayonet training and been killed by accidental penetration to the subclavian artery. Tragic, unavoidable, no negligence found. The instructor involved had been counseled on safety protocols and transferred to another unit within 6 weeks. His career uninterrupted, his reputation intact. But Michael had written her 2 weeks before he died, a letter she still kept in her personal effects, the paper worn soft from being unfolded and refolded too many times. Nothing dramatic in the content, nothing that screamed danger to anyone who didn't know how to read between the lines. Just mentions that training had gotten intense, that one of the instructors was pushing people past their limits in ways that didn't match official protocols, that he'd seen 2 guys carried out with injuries that didn't match the official story. He'd been careful not to complain because Michael knew that complaining was weakness, but he'd wanted her to know, just in case. Just in case. The Inspector General had been blunt during their only face-to-face meeting in a windowless office in Washington that smelled like old documents and newer suspicions. 3 deaths in 18 months, all at the same facility, all during training exercises, all ruled accidental. The pattern was there if you knew how to look for it. But patterns didn't mean proof, and proof was what they needed before they could move against instructors who were decorated, respected, protected by the institutional loyalty that the military valued almost as much as it valued mission success. Pattern recognition wasn't complicated mathematics. Someone was killing people, or letting them die, or creating conditions where death became statistically inevitable rather than tragic aberration. And someone else was making sure the paperwork came out clean. The investigations concluded quickly. The families received their benefits and their condolences and went away satisfied that their sons and daughters had died in service to something larger than themselves. Her orders were simple in concept, infinitely complex in execution. Go in as a routine compliance observer, a paper pusher from North Command sent to review training protocols and make sure everything aligned with current regulations. Don't reveal the investigation. Don't trust the chain of command, because the chain of command might be part of the problem. Document everything. Build a case that couldn't be dismissed or buried or explained away by institutional loyalty. And above all, don't become victim number 4. Because if she died under suspicious circumstances, the investigation would die with her, and nothing would change except the body count. The annex floor opened up before her like an arena, and that comparison wasn't accidental. This was a space designed for combat, for testing limits, for determining who had what it took to survive in environments where hesitation meant death. Mats stretched across half the space, marked with tape lines that had been replaced so many times the rubber underneath was lighter than the surrounding surface, creating a map of wear patterns that told stories about where the hardest impacts happened, where bodies hit the ground most frequently, where the training crossed from controlled exercise into something harder and less forgiving. Weight racks lined the north wall, heavy bags hanging from ceiling chains that looked like they'd been salvaged from a ship, industrial and unforgiving. The sparring cage dominated the far corner, walls made of chain link and floor made of compressed foam that had absorbed 15 years of impact and punishment until it had compressed into something barely softer than concrete. Everything was functional, utilitarian, stripped of anything that might soften the message this place sent, which was that comfort was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. And the only thing that mattered was whether you could perform when everything hurt and every instinct screamed at you to quit. Two instructors stood near the equipment cage, both in their early 30s, both with the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing they owned this space in ways that had nothing to do with rank or official position. One wore a backwards cap and had the laugh of someone who'd never been told no, loud and sharp, and designed to carry across distances. The other had arms crossed and eyes that tracked her movement with the assessment of a predator deciding if new prey was worth the effort or just another waste of energy. "That her?" the first one said, not bothering to lower his voice because, why would he? This was his territory, his space, and new arrivals needed to understand the hierarchy immediately. "Yeah, Voss, compliance observer from North Command. Looks like admin. Probably is. Wonder if she's ever seen real pressure." They didn't stop talking when she passed. They just lowered their voices enough to maintain the fiction of professionalism, that thin veneer that let them claim they weren't being insubordinate or disrespectful, just having a private conversation that happened to be audible to the subject of discussion. She heard every word anyway because she was supposed to hear them. This was the first test, the initial push to see if she'd bristle or challenge or demand respect she hadn't earned. She did none of those things, just kept walking, eyes forward, face neutral, letting their words slide past like rain on steel. She'd been tested before, in Afghanistan when male soldiers decided a female medic couldn't possibly be competent, in training environments where instructors assumed administrative personnel were soft. She'd learned that the best response to testing was no response at all, just quiet competence that eventually made the testing stop because there was no reaction to reinforce. The admin office was a converted storage room with one desk, two filing cabinets that looked like they predated digital record keeping, and a coffee maker that looked like it had survived the Cold War through sheer stubbornness. A staff sergeant sat behind the desk, barely glancing up from his terminal where he was processing what looked like equipment requisition forms, the kind of bureaucratic work that kept facilities running, but never got recognition because it wasn't heroic or dramatic. His name tape read Morrison, and she felt a small jolt of recognition, even though she knew this wasn't her brother. Couldn't be her brother. Her brother was dead and buried in Arlington, with a headstone that said he died in training. Just a common name, a coincidence that felt like the universe reminding her why she was here. "Lieutenant Commander Voss," he said. Statement, not question, because he'd obviously been briefed on her arrival, even if he hadn't been told the real reason for it. Assignment boards posted. Your name's top slot. Integration program, rotation oversight. You start briefing instructors at 0700 tomorrow. She nodded once. Economical movement that didn't waste energy on unnecessary courtesy. Timeline? Rolling start. Full mixed force drills throughout the month. You'll observe, document, make recommendations. Standard evaluation protocol. Understood. He slid a manila folder across the desk, the motion creating a soft whisper against the worn wood surface. Facility access codes, duty roster, safety protocols, everything's in order. She took the folder without opening it because she already knew what was in it, had reviewed the official documentation so many times she could recite it from memory. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Ma'am," he hesitated, just for a second, and something passed across his face that might have been concern or warning, or just the wariness of someone who'd learned not to ask questions, because questions led to complications, and complications led to career problems. Annex runs a little different than standard facilities, just so you're aware. Different how? You'll see. The mezzanine offered a view of the entire floor, a perspective that let her see patterns and relationships that wouldn't be visible from ground level. She took the stairs slowly, boots ringing on the metal steps with a rhythm that was neither rushed nor hesitant, one hand trailing the rail like she was just another person getting oriented to a new facility. Below, more personnel were filtering in, the morning shift arriving to begin another day of pushing human bodies to their limits and beyond. Marines finishing cool-down drills from an earlier session, their movements controlled and precise even in recovery. Navy corpsmen checking supply kits, making sure medical equipment was staged and ready because injuries were inevitable in training this intense. The only question was severity and response time. A handful of SEAL candidates moving through stretches with the mechanical precision of people who'd learned that every movement was evaluated, that sloppiness in warm-up predicted failure under pressure, that discipline was a full-time commitment rather than something you turned on when instructors were watching. And in the center of it all, near the main sparring cage, like a king surveying his kingdom, stood Sergeant Garrett Brennan. She'd studied his file until she could recite it from memory, had spent hours reviewing deployment records and performance evaluations, and the kind of background information that painted pictures of who people were beneath their official personas. 36 years old, which meant he'd been doing this long enough to have patterns, long enough to have refined his methods, long enough to know how to work within systems while bending rules. 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, all of them in combat roles that required the kind of aggressive mentality that kept you alive in situations where hesitation meant death. Distinguished Service Cross for actions in Fallujah, where he'd held a position against enemy advance for 6 hours after his squad leader was killed, calling in air support and coordinating defensive positions while wounded and running low on ammunition. That was real heroism, the kind that earned respect and gratitude, and the assumption that someone capable of that kind of courage under fire must be beyond reproach in peacetime roles. Expert marksman ratings that put him in the top 1% of shooters in the entire Navy. Advanced Combatives Instructor certification that meant he'd been vetted and approved to teach the most dangerous hand-to-hand techniques. Spotless service record except for 3 letters of counseling that had been issued and then withdrawn, all related to excessive force during training exercises, all filed by personnel who no longer worked at this facility, either because they'd transferred, washed out, or been encouraged to find opportunities elsewhere. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of athletic frame that came from functional strength rather than vanity, muscles built through performance rather than appearance. His uniform was immaculate, creases sharp enough to cut, boots polished to a shine that reflected light. His posture was perfect, that parade ground bearing that came from years of discipline and the knowledge that people were always watching, always evaluating, always looking for reasons to question your authority. And when he moved, people got out of his way without being asked, creating space around him like he generated his own gravity field, like proximity to him carried risks that were better avoided. That wasn't fear exactly, more like wary respect, the kind that came from knowing someone was capable of great things and terrible things, and you didn't want to be present for the terrible. He was showing a group of junior instructors a submission hold, demonstrating on a volunteer who'd had the poor judgment or courage to step forward when Brennan asked for demonstration partners. The technique was textbook clean, the kind of thing you'd see in training manuals or instructional videos. Forearm across the throat, opposite hand securing the grip, body weight distributed to control without crushing, pressure applied gradually to give the opponent time to recognize the position and submit before damage occurred. He applied it smoothly, held it for 3 seconds while explaining the mechanics to the watching group, then released immediately when the volunteer tapped. The volunteer rolled away, rubbing his neck, but nodding like he'd learned something valuable, like this was normal and acceptable and just part of the training that would make him better at his job. Then Brennan looked up, and his eyes found hers across 50 feet of open air and the noise of a facility coming to life. The moment stretched, not long enough to be confrontation, but long enough for recognition to pass between them. She was new, She was officer rank. She was watching. And he registered all of that in the space of a heartbeat, his expression shifting through calculations she couldn't quite read, but could sense happening behind his eyes. He smiled, just slightly, and it didn't reach his eyes. The expression was surface-level courtesy, the kind of acknowledgement that military protocol required when officers were present. But underneath it was something else. Assessment, maybe. Dismissal, possibly. The confidence of someone who'd been here long enough to watch oversight come and go without anything changing, who knew that observation didn't mean intervention and protocol didn't mean accountability. She didn't smile back, didn't nod, didn't give him anything except neutral attention, just held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to acknowledge that she'd seen him without turning it into confrontation, then continued her walk along the mezzanine like he was no more interesting than the equipment racks or the training schedule posted on the wall. Behind her, she heard someone say, "Who's that?" Brennan's response carried clearly in the morning air, his voice pitched to be audible without being obvious about it. "New oversight. North Command sent us a babysitter." Laughter followed. Not loud, but present. The kind that established status through exclusion, that created an in-group and an out-group, that made her the subject of jokes before she'd done anything except exist in this space. She kept walking, maintaining her pace, giving no indication that she'd heard or cared. That was important. Reacting to provocations gave them power. Ignoring them revealed them as weak attempts at dominance that didn't deserve acknowledgement. At 700, she attended her first instructor briefing. The room was smaller than expected, more like an oversized closet with a conference table and chairs that didn't match. The kind of space that had been converted from storage because the facility had grown beyond its original design and needed somewhere to hold meetings. 7 instructors filed in, most looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Like briefings were bureaucratic necessities that got in the way of the real work of training. Sergeant Brennan took the chair at the head of the table, even though that wasn't his designated position, wasn't his right based on rank or role, but no one challenged it. The casual assumption of authority was so smooth, so practiced, that challenging it would have felt petty, would have made the challenger look small and concerned with trivialities instead of focused on mission. Master Chief Duncan Halverson entered last, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had absorbed too many years of impact, too many hard landings and heavy loads, and the cumulative toll of a career spent pushing physical limits. He took a seat near the door, positioning himself where he could observe without being central, where he could leave quickly if needed, where he could maintain a separation from the group while still being technically present. He was older than his file suggested, and files always suggested age without conveying the weight of years. The photograph she'd seen showed a man with steel gray hair and the rigid posture of someone who'd spent 40 years in uniform. But photographs couldn't capture the way weight pressed down on him from inside, like he was holding something heavy in a place no one else could see. His eyes, though, his eyes were sharp, tracking everything, missing nothing, seeing patterns and connections that others overlooked because they didn't want to see them, because seeing meant responsibility, and responsibility meant action, and action meant risk. "Morning," Brennan said, not bothering with formalities like rank acknowledgement or official protocols, just diving into content because he'd already established that this was his space and he'd run it his way. "We've got new oversight joining us for the next rotation. Lieutenant Commander Voss, North Command Compliance. She'll be observing drills, checking documentation, making sure we're coloring inside the lines." He gestured toward her without looking, a dismissive wave that reduced her to a bureaucratic necessity rather than a person with authority and purpose. "Standard procedure. Nothing changes on the floor. We run the program the way we've always run it. She takes notes, files her report, everyone's happy." She didn't correct him, didn't claim the floor, didn't assert authority that would have been appropriate given her rank and position. This wasn't her briefing. Not yet. She was here to watch, to learn the temperature of the room, to see who spoke and who stayed silent, and who looked away when certain subjects came up. Current rotation includes advanced combatives integration, Brennan continued. We've got 12 SEAL candidates, 8 Marine Force Recon, 4 Army Rangers, mix of experience levels. Some have seen combat, some are fresh from basic training. Training focus is on cross-service standardization and stress inoculation. We push hard because combat pushes hard. That's the program. One of the younger instructors raised a hand, tentative gesture that suggested uncertainty about whether questions were welcome. What's the injury threshold for this cycle? Same as always. If they can't handle the pace, they wash out. Brennan's tone made it clear this was final, not open for discussion. Sir, last cycle is over. Brennan's voice didn't rise, but it hardened, became steel wrapped in silk. Current cycle, current standards. We're training warriors, not filing complaints about hurt feelings and sore muscles. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from collective decision to stop pushing, to accept what's been said, to move on rather than escalate. The instructor who'd asked the question looked down at his notes, face carefully neutral. No one else spoke. Lieutenant Commander, Brennan said, finally looking at her directly. Anything you want to add? Any specific areas of concern from North Command? It was a test wrapped in courtesy. Say nothing, and she'd established herself as passive oversight. Say too much, and she'd mark herself as a threat before she had enough information to be dangerous. I'm here to observe, she said, voice neutral, giving nothing. Document training protocols, injury rates, safety compliance, standard evaluation. I'll stay out of your way. Appreciate that, he smiled, and this time it was almost genuine. We run a tight program here, best in the Navy. You'll see that. When it ended, the instructors filtered out quickly, most avoiding eye contact with her. Master Chief Halverson was the last to leave. He paused at the door, turned back like he'd forgotten something, and his eyes met hers for exactly 2 seconds. No words, no gesture, just eye contact that carried weight she couldn't quite interpret, but felt, nevertheless. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the empty briefing room. The morning training session started at 800 with formation on the main floor. Candidates stood in neat rows, backs straight, eyes forward, while Brennan walked the line with the slow assessment of someone inspecting equipment for defects rather than people for capability. He stopped occasionally, adjusted a stance with hands that looked helpful but felt intrusive, made comments too quiet for Voss to hear from her position near the mezzanine stairs. Whatever he said made people stand straighter, made faces go blank with concentration, made the entire formation radiate tension that hadn't been present before he began his inspection. That was power, the ability to alter atmosphere through presence. Below her, the training began with warm-up drills, push-ups that started controlled and accelerated into controlled chaos. Pull-ups that separated those who could from those who couldn't quite. Sprint intervals that pushed cardiovascular systems to edges and beyond, finding limits and then demanding people ignore them. This was standard, controlled, exactly what the manuals prescribed for high-intensity training. It was also theater. The real training, the kind that separated this facility from others, happened when outsiders weren't watching, when cameras had blind spots, when the only witnesses were people who'd learned not to see. At 0847, Brennan called for partner drills, combat conditioning, controlled sparring, rotating pairs. The candidates moved into position without hesitation, muscle memory taking over. Voss watched carefully. Then her eyes caught movement in the peripheral cage, the smaller training area used for advanced work and demonstration. Brennan had a volunteer in a rear choke, the classic rear naked choke that was one of the most effective submissions in combat sports and one of the most dangerous if applied incorrectly or held too long. The technique itself was clean, demonstrating proper hand position and body mechanics. What wasn't clean was the way he held it 3 seconds past the point where the volunteer tapped twice on his forearm. 3 seconds where the man's face started to flush, and his body went from controlled response to desperate need for air. 3 seconds where every person watching understood that the hold continued, not because of instruction, but because of power. Because Brennan was demonstrating that submission signals were suggestions rather than commands. When he released, the volunteer stumbled back, one hand going to his throat, gasping for air that had been denied longer than necessary. No one said anything. The watching instructors nodded like they'd learned something valuable. Brennan smiled, that same surface expression that didn't reach his eyes. That's the difference between knowing a technique and mastering it. Control, timing, making sure they understand who sets the limits, who decides when it's over, who holds the power in every exchange. Voss wrote nothing in her notebook, but she filed it away in the part of her mind that was building a catalog of moments that didn't quite cross the line, but stood right on the edge of it, testing the boundary, establishing a culture where excess was normal and questioning was weakness. She spent lunch reviewing facility records in the small office they'd assigned her. Personnel files, training schedules, injury reports from the past 2 years, all of it meticulously maintained because the military ran on documentation. The official documentation was immaculate. Every exercise logged, every safety protocol checked, every injury accounted for. 3 deaths over 18 months. Petty Officer David Halverson, underwater drill, panic response leading to drowning. Lance Corporal James Mitchell, blunt force trauma during combatives. Failed to properly protect his head during takedown. Specialist First Class Aaron Torres, heat stroke during punishment PT, pre-existing cardiac condition. All investigated by official boards, all ruled accidental, all closed with recommendations for enhanced safety briefings. Perfect paperwork that told stories matching official narratives. Except, she pulled up the medical examiner's preliminary reports, the ones filed before the official investigations concluded, before institutional interests shaped final documentation. These were raw assessments, clinical observations made before politics entered the equation. Different language, different tone, different conclusions that had been softened or removed by the time final reports were published. Halverson's report noted bruising patterns consistent with sustained pressure beyond recommended hold duration. Patterns suggesting prolonged compression of throat structures rather than panic-induced self-harm during drowning. Mitchell's noted injury severity disproportionate to described training intensity, suggesting force levels exceeding safety protocols. Torres's noted contributing factors, including inadequate hydration protocols and excessive equipment weight that shouldn't have been present during routine PT. These observations didn't make it into the final reports. Someone had smoothed them out, removed anything that suggested negligence or malice, replaced clinical precision with bureaucratic vagueness. Someone with enough authority to edit a medical examiner's conclusions and enough motivation to make sure those edits stuck. She photographed the relevant pages with her phone, using software that embedded metadata proving when and where the images were captured, creating chains of evidence that would be harder to dismiss than verbal testimony. Encrypted them with algorithms that required 3 separate passwords to access. Uploaded them to a secure server that existed outside the Navy's network, building the case, one document at a time, one inconsistency at a time. At 14:30, there was a knock on her door. Not the sharp rap of someone demanding entrance, but the softer knock of someone asking permission, someone uncertain about welcome. Master Chief Duncan Halverson stood in the hallway, cap in hand, expression neutral, but eyes carrying weight that suggested this wasn't casual visit. "Ma'am, got a minute?" "Of course, Master Chief." He stepped inside, closed the door gently behind him, and stood with his back to it like he was blocking an exit or preventing interruption, or both. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied her with those sharp eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "You're not here for compliance," he finally said. Not accusation, not question, just statement delivered with certainty. She set down her pen, gave him her full attention. Why would you say that? Because compliance observers don't read medical examiners' preliminary reports. They don't spend 20 minutes on the mezzanine mapping camera positions. They don't take photos of documents that aren't part of their official review. He paused. And they don't look at Sergeant Brennan the way you looked at him this morning. Smart, observant. She made a decision, one of those pivotal moments where you could retreat behind cover story or risk trust that might be misplaced. Your godson, David Halverson. I read his file. Something cracked in the Master Chief's expression, just for a second, before discipline reasserted itself. But in that second she saw grief, raw and unhealed. Then you know it wasn't panic, he said, voice carefully controlled. David didn't panic. Kid could hold his breath for 4 minutes in perfect control. I trained him myself, started when he was 16 and wanted to be a Navy diver. The official report says, the official report is a lie. His voice stayed level, but barely. And I've got 18 months of evidence proving it, if anyone cared enough to look. She closed her laptop, cleared space on her desk. I'm looking. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. He set it on her desk like he was placing a bet he wasn't sure he'd win. Witness statements I collected on my own time. Maintenance logs showing safety equipment failures that were logged and then mysteriously disappeared. Audio recordings of conversations where people admitted they knew something was wrong. And 3 autopsy reports, original versions, before they were sanitized. She didn't touch the drive immediately. Why now? Why not 18 months ago? Because 18 months ago, I trusted the chain of command to do the right thing. I filed reports, made noise, requested formal investigations, got told to stand down, that the investigation was thorough, that my grief was clouding my judgment. His jaw tightened. I'm done trusting the chain of command. But I'm also 68 years old, 3 months from retirement, and they can dismiss me as a bitter old man. You, though, you're IG, aren't you? Or working with them? She didn't confirm it. The silence was answer enough. I trained half the instructors in this facility, he continued, words coming faster. Taught them discipline, honor, the idea that strength means protecting the people who depend on you. Somewhere along the way that got twisted, became about dominance, about proving toughness through suffering rather than building capability. He looked down at the USB drive, then back at her. David was 22. He called me 3 days before he died, said training was getting dangerous, said Brennan was pushing people past safety limits, said he'd seen 2 guys carried out with injuries that didn't match official explanations. I told him to tough it out, that SEAL training was supposed to be hard, that he needed to trust the process. His voice cracked. Last conversation I ever had with him, and I told him to trust the process that killed him. Voss picked up the drive. I'll need time to verify everything, build a case that can't be dismissed. How much time? As long as it takes to do it right. Rushed investigations get buried by procedural challenges. I won't let that happen. He nodded slowly. Brennan knows something's coming. He's been on edge all week. If he figures out you're a threat before you've secured evidence, I can handle Sergeant Brennan. With respect, ma'am, no you can't. Not physically. Not if he decides you're a problem. Halverson met her eyes. David could handle himself too. Combat medic training, hand-to-hand certification, 2 years of preparation. That didn't save him. The warning hung in the air. She knew he was right. But showing fear now would undermine everything. I didn't come here to fight, she said carefully. I came here to investigate, document, build a case that will result in prosecution and systemic change. And I'll do that job whether it's dangerous or not, because 3 people are dead and their families deserve truth. He studied her, then nodded once and turned for the door. Stopped with his hand on the handle. My godson's name was David Michael Halverson. He wanted to be a para-rescue jumper, wanted to spend his career saving lives. Instead, he became a statistic in a training program that values brutality over excellence. Don't let him be forgotten. Don't let his death mean nothing. Make this mean something. I will, she said, and it was a promise she intended to keep. The notification came through at 1847 hours, 3 days after Master Chief Halverson had handed her the USB drive. A single line on the digital training board, glowing white against black background. Voluntary night conditioning drill, 1900 hours. All instructors encouraged to participate. Demonstration lead, Sergeant Brennan. Voluntary was a word that meant something different in military culture than it did in the civilian world. Voluntary meant optional only if you were willing to accept the consequences of absence, which included being marked as uncommitted, soft, someone who prioritized comfort over excellence. In a place like the Combat Training Annex, voluntary wasn't voluntary at all. It was mandatory wrapped in the fiction of choice. Ilara Voss stood in front of that board for 30 seconds, reading the message 3 times, understanding exactly what it was. An invitation that was really a challenge, a test disguised as training opportunity, a trap that she could see but couldn't avoid because avoiding it would mark her as someone who didn't belong. Brennan was calling her out without saying her name, creating a situation where she either showed up and submitted to his authority on his terms, or stayed away and confirmed every assumption he'd made about paper rank and administrative oversight. She checked her watch, 12 minutes, just enough time to change into training gear and make a choice she'd probably been going to make since the moment she walked through the annex doors. The locker room was empty at this hour, just the hum of ventilation and the smell of disinfectant. She stripped out of her uniform, folded it precisely, and pulled on compression shorts and a moisture-wicking shirt. Her hands moved through the familiar ritual of wrapping her wrists. No jewelry, no watch. Nothing that could catch or tear, just her body and her training. She studied herself in the mirror for a moment. The bruises from Afghanistan had faded years ago, but the body remembered them. 2 purple hearts, one from shrapnel when the convoy she was riding in hit an IED outside Kandahar. One from a Taliban fighter who'd gotten inside the perimeter while she was working on a wounded Marine, had put a knife through her shoulder before someone shot him. 4 inches of steel that had missed major vessels by millimeters. Both times she kept working, kept her hands steady, kept the patient alive until medevac arrived, because that was the job, and the job didn't stop because you were hurt. This was different from combat. This was training, which meant rules, safety protocols, witnesses, except she'd spent the last 72 hours reviewing Halverson's evidence, and she knew exactly how much those rules and protocols were worth when the people enforcing them decided they didn't apply. She walked to the training floor at 1858, arriving with 2 minutes to spare. The main lights were dimmed, leaving only the overhead floods. A dozen people were already present, mostly instructors, a few senior candidates. No one spoke. They just stood in loose clusters, waiting, the tension thick enough to taste. Brennan stood in the center of the main cage, rolling his shoulders, already warmed up. He wore no shirt, just compression shorts and hand wraps, his torso mapped with the kind of muscle that came from functional training. Scars traced his ribs on the left side, old shrapnel wounds that had healed white against tan skin. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man standing in the center of his kingdom. His eyes found her as she approached. "Lieutenant Commander, glad you could make it. Thought you might decide observation was more your speed." She stepped to the edge of the mat, arms loose, breathing steady. "Wouldn't miss it. When someone extends an invitation this publicly, declining would be rude." "Good attitude. We're doing stress conditioning tonight. Live sparring, rotating partners, limited rules. Keeps everyone sharp. Makes sure people remember what real pressure feels like." He gestured around the cage. "Safety protocols apply, but this isn't daylight drilling. We push harder, move faster." She noticed what he didn't say. No mention of mandatory protective gear. No identification of safety monitors. No statement about tap-out procedures. This was the gray space, the zone where official policy ended and unspoken custom began. Understood, she said. You sure you want to participate? No shame in observing your first time. It was offered with surface courtesy, but the undertone was clear. Last chance to back down. She stepped onto the mat. I'm sure. Someone wolf whistled from the shadows. Someone else laughed. Brennan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. All right then. Standard rules such as they are. Submission or referee stop. Respect the tap when you're ready to stop. Keep it clean enough that nobody needs a hospital. He looked around. Kowalski, you're up first with Hayes. Let's see some intensity. Two instructors stepped forward and began their round. It started controlled, technical, both men testing range and timing. Then it accelerated, became harder, the sound of impact carrying across the floor. A takedown that was more throw than technique. A choke that held 3 seconds past the first tap before being released with a grin. This was the demonstration, the model, the unspoken instruction about what was expected tonight, which was that control was optional and mercy was weakness. Voss watched without expression, cataloging everything. The faces of people who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The ones who nodded approval. The way Brennan orchestrated it all with small gestures. 3 more rounds followed the first, each one pushing the boundary further. By the time the 5th pair stepped up, someone was bleeding from a cut above the eye, and no one had stopped the action. Blood on the mats was badge of honor. Then Brennan looked at her, expression neutral but eyes carrying weight. Lieutenant Commander, you're up. She stepped forward, no hesitation. Who's your partner? One of the watching instructors asked. Brennan smiled. I'll take this one. Give our new observer a proper introduction to the program. The cage seemed smaller suddenly. They circled once, not speaking, both taking measure. He moved well, weight balanced perfectly, hands loose and ready. She matched his movement, staying outside his range, breathing steady. He struck first, testing jab at medium speed. She slipped it, not by much, just enough to show she could track fast movement. Reset her position. He nodded slightly. The second exchange came faster. Jab, cross, leg kick combination. She moved through it, reading the rhythm. Blocked the jab, parried the cross, checked the kick with her shin hard enough that the impact rang clear. His eyebrows raised slightly. They engaged again, closer now, testing strength rather than speed. He got a grip on her wrist, tried to twist into an armbar. She countered, used his momentum to circle out, broke the grip with a sharp pull. He smiled. Not bad, Commander. Better than I expected from someone who came up through medical rather than combat specialties. She didn't answer, just maintained position, conserved energy. The tempo increased. He was done testing. Now he was applying pressure, using his size and strength advantage. A driving tackle that forced her backward. A clinch where his weight pressed down. She defended, adjusted, survived without giving him the finish he wanted. Then he shifted tactics. Went low, shot for her legs with shocking speed. This time he got them, wrapped both arms around her knees, and drove forward. The takedown was clean and hard, her back hitting the mat with force that drove air from her lungs. Before she could recover, he was on her, transitioning to back control with smooth efficiency. His arms slid around her neck, not fast or violent, but inexorable. The rear naked choke, one of the oldest and most effective submissions in combat sports. Done correctly with proper supervision, it was a safe training tool. Done incorrectly or held too long, it could injure the trachea, damage the carotid arteries, cause stroke or death. Done deliberately past the point of submission, it was assault wrapped in training terminology. She felt the pressure build across her throat, not crushing yet, but present, a reminder that he had the position, had the control. Her hands came up instinctively, one grabbing his wrist, the other reaching back to defend. The proper response was to tap, signal submission. Anything else was ego and stupidity. She tapped once on his forearm. Clear signal. Unmistakable. The universal gesture that meant, stop, I submit, you win, let go. He held. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. But 2 seconds past a tap was 2 seconds of unauthorized force. 2 seconds of holding someone in a position where they couldn't breathe. 2 seconds that communicated something that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with power. She tapped again, harder this time, her other hand beating against his arm with urgency that bordered on panic. The pressure across her throat was steady, not increasing but not decreasing, maintaining exactly enough compression to make breathing difficult. Her vision started to narrow at the edges, the black creeping in like storm clouds. Her body shifted from controlled defense to survival response. She tucked her chin, trying to create space, shifted her hips, trying to alleviate the pressure. All the technical responses becoming frantic animal movement as oxygen deprivation triggered panic. The faces watching from outside the cage were blurred now, reduced to shapes and shadows. She couldn't tell if anyone was moving to intervene. Couldn't tell anything except that the pressure was absolute and the darkness was spreading, and she had maybe 3 more seconds. Then he let go. She gasped, rolled away, came up on hands and knees with her chest heaving and her throat burning. The air tasted like copper, and shame, and rage she didn't have the breath to express. Her hands shook, adrenaline dump hitting hard. Brennan stood, casual as someone finishing a training drill. He offered his hand. "You good, Commander?" She didn't take the hand, just pushed herself upright, one hand going to her neck where she could already feel the heat of inflammation. Her voice came out rough, damaged. "I tapped." "Did you?" "Sorry, hard to feel sometimes in the chaos of a good roll. Night drills are different from daytime training, more realistic. Combat doesn't give you time to tap out when things get uncomfortable." The excuse was perfect, reasonable, delivered with enough surface concern to seem legitimate, and completely, deliberately false. She'd seen his eyes during the hold, had understood in that moment that he'd known exactly what he was doing. No one spoke. The watching instructors shifted weight, looked elsewhere, made the collective decision that they'd seen nothing worth commenting on. This was normal. This was how night drills worked. She wanted to challenge it, wanted to call out the violation in front of everyone. But that would accomplish nothing except marking her as someone who couldn't handle the culture. It would burn her cover and end the investigation before she'd built enough evidence. So she did the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder than staying conscious in burning vehicles while shrapnel wounds bled, harder than working on patients while someone tried to kill her. She nodded once, like she accepted his explanation, and stepped out of the cage. Her legs felt uncertain, balance still recovering. She walked carefully to the edge of the mat, picked up the water bottle she'd left there, took a long drink. The liquid was cold against her damaged throat, sharp and painful and grounding. Behind her, the next round was starting. Voices calling out encouragement, the sound of bodies hitting mats resuming like nothing had happened. Because nothing had happened. Not officially, just training, just conditioning. She stayed for another 20 minutes, watching with a face that revealed nothing, cataloging violations while her throat throbbed and her pulse slowly returned to normal. Making mental notes about who participated and who looked away, who nodded approval, and who seemed uncomfortable but didn't intervene. When it finally ended at 20:30, people dispersed quickly. No debrief, no safety check, no official acknowledgement that anything noteworthy had happened. She was walking toward the locker room when a voice stopped her. "Ma'am." Corporal Jules stood in the shadow near the equipment lockers, young face tight with something that looked like concern mixed with fear. He glanced around to make sure they weren't being watched, then stepped closer, voice dropping to near whisper. "That wasn't right. What happened in there? You tapped twice. He saw it. I saw him see it. It's fine, Corporal. It's not fine, ma'am. I've seen him do it before. To other people. Always has an excuse. Always makes it seem like an accident or training intensity. He hesitated, then pulled out his phone with the furtive motion of someone doing something they knew was risky. I recorded it. Not officially, just on my phone. I've been documenting these sessions because I thought maybe someone should have evidence. She looked at the phone, then at his face, reading the conflict there. He was taking enormous risk by approaching her. Why are you telling me this? Because someone needs to know. Because I joined this program to learn how to protect people, not to watch instructors abuse them. And because I think you're here for a reason that has nothing to do with compliance reports. He met her eyes. I think you're here to stop this, and I want to help. Smart kid, observant, willing to take risks. Send me the video. Encrypt it if you can. And Corporal, she held his gaze. Be careful who you talk to about this. People who challenge the system have ways of disappearing. He nodded, already backing away. Yes, ma'am, you too. You should know Brennan's been watching you all week, talking to people about you, making sure everyone understands you're here to cause problems. If he figures out what you're really investigating, I can handle Sergeant Brennan. I hope so, ma'am, because the last person who tried to report him ended up washing out 3 weeks later with injuries that conveniently matched official training accidents, but everyone knew were retaliation. He turned and left quickly, disappearing into the shadows. She made it to the locker room before the shaking started. Not fear exactly, though fear was part of it, mostly rage. Cold and clean and absolutely useless unless she could channel it into something productive. This was what Michael had faced. This was the culture that had killed him. The unspoken rule that tapping out was weakness and holding past the tap was just part of making people strong. And when someone died, when the pressure went too far, the system protected its own and called it tragedy. She pulled out her phone, opened the encrypted messaging app that connected her to the Inspector General's office, and typed a message with hands that were steadier than they should have been. Progress made. Evidence collected. Physical assault occurred during voluntary training session. Need to accelerate timeline. Situation deteriorating faster than anticipated. The response came back in less than a minute. Negative. Maintain cover. Build case. No premature action that could compromise investigation or alert targets. She wanted to throw the phone against the wall, but that would accomplish nothing. Rushed investigations got buried by procedural challenges. She knew that, had learned it the hard way with Michael's death. So she swallowed the rage, locked it down in the same place she kept her fear and her grief, and focused on what she could control. Documentation, evidence, building the kind of case that couldn't be dismissed. Her phone buzzed. The video from Corporal Jules, sent through an encrypted service. She downloaded it, watched it once with clinical detachment. Grainy phone footage, poor lighting, but unmistakable content. Her tapping, his holding. The exact duration of the unauthorized force clearly visible in the timestamp. 7.4 seconds from first tap to release. She added it to the growing file. One more piece of evidence. One more documented violation. One more brick in the case she was building. The bruising looked worse the next morning, purple and yellow blooming across her throat in the exact pattern of Brennan's forearm. Impossible to hide completely, even with her collar pulled high. She'd skipped the infirmary, knowing that medical documentation of training injuries was monitored. Better to let it heal on its own, wear it like a badge that said she could absorb punishment without complaint. She arrived at the annex at 6:15, earlier than required. The building was quiet at this hour. She moved through the space methodically, checking camera positions she'd documented earlier, noting sight lines and coverage gaps. The security system was older than it should have been, cameras mounted in obvious positions that people had learned to work around. Standard security theater. But there were also motion-triggered backup units, smaller and less obvious, installed after an equipment theft 2 years ago. Most people didn't know about them. She pulled up the security log on her tablet, accessing the system with credentials that technically weren't authorized for her, but that no one had thought to revoke. She scrolled back to the night drill session, found the timestamp, isolated the footage. The main cameras showed exactly what she expected: gaps in coverage, blind spots conveniently positioned, the official record showing nothing problematic. But the backup motion unit had triggered at 1917 hours, running for 3 minutes before automatically shutting down. She isolated the footage. Infrared, no sound, but the shapes were clear enough. Her body, his body, the position, the hold, the duration, time-stamped and date-stamped and impossible to explain away. She copied the file to an encrypted drive, then did something that felt like defiance or maybe desperation. She left the original in the system, but flagged it with an administrative hold that would prevent it from being automatically deleted during the standard 30-day purge cycle. If anyone looked, they'd see it, but no one was looking. By 0700, the annex was populated and operational. She attended the morning briefing with her throat still tender and her collar still high, answering questions about training observations with bland professionalism. Brennan nodded at her once across the room, expression neutral, like they'd never been in a cage together. The day proceeded according to schedule. Morning drills, afternoon equipment maintenance, evening combatives training. She observed, documented, played her role. And she watched. Watched the way Brennan moved through the facility like gravity bent around him. Watched the junior instructors mirror his behavior, holding submissions longer than necessary. Watched the way Master Chief Halverson stood in the corner, arms crossed, face expressionless, seeing everything and saying nothing. At 14:30, she returned to her office to find someone had been inside. Nothing obvious, just small things. Her notebook moved 3 inches to the left. The chair pushed in more than she typically did. The drawer with her encrypted tablet opened and closed. The microscopic piece of tape she'd placed across the seal broken. Someone was checking on her. Measuring the threat, standard counterintelligence work. She sat down, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and wrote out innocuous observations about training cadence and equipment utilization. Then she pulled out her phone, opened the encrypted app, and sent a new message. Office compromised, surveillance likely. Someone is monitoring my activities and assessing threat level. Request accelerated extraction protocol if situation becomes untenable. The response took 3 minutes. Noted, maintain position. Evidence threshold not yet met for prosecution. Continue building case. No premature action. She wanted to scream that the evidence threshold should be 3 dead bodies and documented abuse captured on video. But she understood the calculation. Prosecuting active duty instructors required overwhelming proof, multiple corroborating sources, a case so airtight that institutional loyalty couldn't crack it. So she stayed, maintained her position, continued building the case while the people she was investigating pressed closer. That evening, the training board announced another voluntary session. Live fire stress shooting, night operation simulation, instructor participation encouraged. Another test, another opportunity to prove herself or reveal weakness. She showed up at 1900 sharp, wearing full gear, rifle loaded with training ammunition. The course was set up in the auxiliary range, a building that simulated urban combat environments with movable walls and pop-up targets, and darkness broken only by occasional muzzle flash. Brennan briefed the safety protocols. Keep weapons pointed down range. Treat every malfunction as a hot failure. Respect the range commands. All standard, all by the book. She ran the course third in rotation, moving through the simulated building with rifle up and ready, engaging targets as they appeared. The training ammunition was non-lethal, but still generated recoil that had to be managed. She cleared the first 3 rooms without incident, smooth and professional. In the 4th room, her rifle jammed. Not a standard stoppage. The trigger pull felt wrong, mushy, like something in the firing mechanism had broken. She immediately applied remedial action. Tap, rack, bang, but the malfunction persisted. Dead trigger. Complete failure of the firing system. She called ceasefire immediately, dropped the magazine, locked the bolt to the rear, and stepped back. Range safety protocols. Exactly by the book. Brennan appeared from the observation room, took the rifle. Firing pin, he said after a moment, examining the mechanism. Looks like fatigue failure. Old equipment, high round count. Happens sometimes. He handed the rifle back like that explained everything. She looked at the firing pin assembly, noted the clean break across the pin shaft. Not fatigue failure, which showed progressive cracking. This was a fresh break, sharp-edged, the kind that happened when metal was deliberately weakened and then stressed to failure. She said nothing, just cleared the weapon completely and carried it back to the armory for documentation and replacement. But she photographed the firing pin before turning it in, capturing the break pattern, the lack of corrosion that would indicate age-related failure, the evidence that this wasn't accident, but deliberate sabotage. Someone had tampered with her rifle. Another message, another escalation. She filed the standard equipment failure report, maintained the fiction that this was routine, but she also sent the photographs to her encrypted storage, adding them to the file. That night, she couldn't sleep. Lay in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, throat still sore, mind running through scenarios and responses. 3 people were dead. She had evidence of abuse, of violation, of equipment sabotage. She had witness statements and medical reports and video documentation showing pattern of unauthorized force. But she didn't have the thing that mattered most, which was proof that the deaths weren't accidents, proof that someone had deliberately caused them. Without that, she had a case for misconduct. With it, she had a case for murder. The USB drive Halverson had given her sat in her pocket. She pulled it out, turned it over in her fingers, thinking about what it represented, about the accumulated evidence of 18 months of solitary investigation. She plugged the drive into her laptop, opened the files for what felt like the 100th time. Witness statements from people who'd been present during David Halverson's drowning, descriptions that didn't match the official narrative. Maintenance logs showing the underwater training equipment had been modified the day before the incident, modifications that weren't approved or documented, changes that altered safety parameters in ways that created increased risk, audio recordings of conversations where instructors discussed the need to wash out the weak ones and make examples. And then there was the autopsy report, the original version before it had been edited. Contusions around the throat, consistent with sustained pressure beyond recommended hold duration. Laryngeal bruising suggesting prolonged compression that wouldn't result from brief panic or self-inflicted injury. Time of death calculations that didn't match the official timeline, suggesting David had died earlier than witnesses claimed, and that the delay in reporting had been deliberate. David Halverson hadn't drowned from panic during a training drill. He'd been held underwater past the point of survival, and someone had watched him die. And then everyone involved had agreed it was an accident because admitting otherwise would destroy the program. She closed the laptop, sat in darkness broken only by the faint glow of streetlights through the window, and made a decision. The investigation couldn't wait for perfect evidence, couldn't proceed at the cautious pace that bureaucrats preferred. Every day she delayed was another day Brennan and his network had to identify her as a threat, to destroy evidence, to create another accident. She needed to force their hand, make them act in ways that would expose them, create a situation where the evidence became undeniable because it was generated in real time under observation that couldn't be dismissed. It was risky, possibly stupid, definitely against the cautious approach the Inspector General had ordered. But caution hadn't saved Michael. Caution hadn't saved David Halverson or James Mitchell or Aaron Torres. Caution was what let institutional inertia protect murderers. She opened her secure messaging app and typed out a new message. Request authorization for accelerated confrontation protocol. Evidence sufficient for preliminary action. Continuing passive observation creates unacceptable risk to investigation and investigator. Targets are aware of surveillance and taking steps to neutralize threat. The response came back after 15 minutes that felt like hours. Request denied. Maintain cover. Continue documentation. Timeline holds. No premature action that could compromise investigation or alert targets to full scope of evidence collection. She stared at the message for a long time, feeling the weight of bureaucracy and chain of command and people making decisions from safe distances who didn't have bruises on their throats or sabotaged rifles. Then she closed the app, opened a new document, and began drafting something that wasn't approved or authorized or safe. A formal challenge, a demand for public evaluation, the kind of thing that would force Brennan to either accept or back down, and either choice would reveal something the investigation needed to know. She was done waiting, done being careful, done letting the system protect people who'd proven they didn't deserve protection. And if that meant breaking protocol, if it meant risking her career and possibly her life, well, she'd made harder choices in Afghanistan while holding pressure on wounds that wanted to bleed out. At least this time, the only person at guaranteed risk was her. The document took 2 hours to write, every word chosen carefully, every phrase calibrated to sound official, while carrying an undercurrent of challenge. A request for formal training evaluation, her as subject, Brennan as evaluator, full safety protocols and observation standards applied as required by regulation for official evaluations. The kind of thing that couldn't be refused without losing face, that would create a documented event with witnesses and cameras and accountability that didn't exist in voluntary night drills where rules were optional and violations were normal. She saved it, encrypted it, scheduled it to be submitted through official channels at 600 the next morning so that everyone would see it simultaneously, so that there would be no opportunity for quiet intervention or negotiation or pressure to withdraw the request before it became public. Then she lay back down, closed her eyes, and tried to find sleep that wouldn't come easily because she just committed to a course of action that would either expose the truth or expose her to retaliation that would be carefully disguised as something else. The notification went live at 600 sharp, appearing on every terminal and training board across the facility like a declaration of war disguised as administrative procedure. Combat Integration Program Performance Evaluation Demonstration. Date Friday, 1600 hours. Demonstration lead, Sergeant Garrett Brennan. Evaluator, Lieutenant Commander Alara Voss. Observer Rotation Coordinator, Master Chief Duncan Halverson. Attendance mandatory for all instructional staff. Recording via master terminal in accordance with oversight protocols and documentation requirements. By 6:30, the entire annex was buzzing with speculation and reaction. Voices carried across the mat spaces, through the equipment cages, up to the mezzanine observation deck, where people gathered to discuss what this meant. She handpicked him. No, she didn't. This is standard rotation protocol. Nothing standard about this. This is a call-out. Brennan's going to destroy her. Maybe she's going to destroy him. The speculation spread like electrical current through water, energizing everyone it touched, creating a charge in the air that made even routine morning drills feel heavier with anticipation and tension. People who normally avoided instructor politics suddenly had opinions. People who'd stayed silent about concerns suddenly found voices for speculation. The entire facility was recalibrating, trying to understand what this meant, what was really happening beneath the surface of official procedure. Alara Voss stood in the admin office, reviewing training schedules like the notification was just another line item in her compliance work, like she hadn't spent half the night drafting it and the other half wondering if it would be the last administrative action she'd take before being removed from the facility or worse. But she could feel the weight of attention pressing against her from every direction, could sense people walking past more slowly than necessary and glancing through the office window, could hear conversations that dropped to whispers when she approached. At 7:15, Brennan appeared in her doorway. He didn't knock, didn't wait for invitation, just leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, an expression somewhere between amused and evaluating, like he was trying to decide whether she was threat or entertainment. "Public demonstration," he said without preamble. "Bold move, Commander, very bold." She looked up from her tablet, face neutral. Standard evaluation protocol. Nothing bold about following established procedures for instructor assessment, except you chose me specifically. Could have rotated through any instructor on the roster. Could have observed existing training sessions without making it formal evaluation. Instead, you called out the senior combatives lead for public demonstration. He smiled without warmth. People might think you're making a statement rather than conducting routine oversight. People can think whatever they want. I'm here to evaluate training effectiveness. You run the most advanced program in the facility. Makes sense to start assessment at the top rather than working up from junior instructors. Does it? He stepped into the office, uninvited, making the small space smaller through presence rather than physical dimensions. Or maybe you've got concerns about my methods. Maybe that little incident during night drill left you with questions about how we do things here. Maybe you think public observation will reveal problems that private observation missed. She met his eyes without flinching, without showing any of the concern she felt about having him this close in a confined space where no one would hear if something went wrong. "If I had concerns, I'd document them through proper channels and submit reports through established chain of command. This is just an evaluation. Full observation, full safety protocols, exactly by the book that governs all official training assessments." By the book, he repeated the phrase like it tasted strange in his mouth, like he was examining it for hidden meaning. "You know what I like about books, Commander? You can close them when you're done reading. Real training doesn't close that easy. Real preparation for combat doesn't stop when someone gets uncomfortable or scared or realizes they're not as tough as they thought. Then you should have no problem demonstrating proper techniques under full observation with official documentation. Should be routine for someone with your experience and credentials." The moment held, both of them understanding this was negotiation disguised as conversation, conflict wrapped in professional courtesy. He was testing her resolve, looking for weakness or hesitation that would let him dismiss this as administrative overreach from someone who didn't understand the culture. She was showing him that she wasn't backing down, wasn't intimidated, wasn't going to let unauthorized chokeholds disappear into the category of things no one talked about because talking meant complications. "Friday at 1600, he finally said, voice carrying something that might have been respect or might have been recognition of worthy opponent. "I'll give you a demonstration worth evaluating, something you can put in all your reports and send up the chain to people who've never trained a real warrior in their lives." He left without waiting for response, his boots heavy on the tile, and she released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, adrenaline slowly draining away and leaving her aware of how tense she'd been during that entire exchange. The trap was set. She was reviewing maintenance logs from 18 months ago, cross-referencing equipment inspection dates with training schedules, building the timeline that would connect dots the official investigation had deliberately left scattered and unconnected. "Ma'am," he closed the door behind him, lowered his voice to barely above whisper. "What are you doing? What were you thinking when you posted that challenge?" "My job." "Your job is investigating quietly, building a case, not challenging Brennan to public combat that he spent his entire career preparing for. His expression was harder than she'd seen before. Fear mixed with anger, mixed with something that looked like paternal concern from someone who'd already lost one person he cared about and didn't want to lose another. You just put a target on yourself that you can't take off, that will follow you until this is resolved, one way or another. Good. Maybe he'll aim at me instead of someone who can't defend themselves, someone who doesn't know what they're walking into. Or maybe he'll do to you what he did to David. The name came out rough, unsteady, emotion breaking through control. You think this is about justice, about holding people accountable for violations and crimes? But you're forgetting that the people you're trying to hold accountable control the space, set the rules, have every advantage, including the loyalty of people who lie for them because their careers depend on maintaining the status quo. She set down the file she'd been reading, gave him her full attention. I've seen your evidence, Master Chief. I've reviewed the witness statements, the autopsy reports, the maintenance logs showing equipment sabotage. Your godson didn't panic during a routine drill. He was murdered, and so were Mitchell and Torres. But having evidence isn't enough if no one's willing to force it into the light, if no one's willing to take the risk of making it public and undeniable. So you're going to get yourself killed to prove a point? To demonstrate that the system is broken? We already know the system is broken. That's not revelation, that's reality. I'm going to create a situation where Brennan has to operate under full observation, with cameras and witnesses and safety protocols he can't ignore without revealing exactly what he is. Where if he violates regulations, it's documented in ways that can't be explained away or buried in paperwork that no one reads. She met his eyes. And yes, that puts me at risk. But people have been dying here for 18 months because everyone's too scared to take that risk, too worried about careers and reputations to challenge authority, even when authority is killing people. Halverson looked at her for a long moment, jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out, processing arguments he wanted to make, but knew wouldn't change her mind. Finally, he shook his head. You're going to need help. People willing to stand witness when the system tries to protect itself, when the natural response is to close ranks and defend institutional interests. Are you offering? I'm saying I'm done watching people die and filing reports that disappear into bureaucratic black holes where nothing happens except time passes and wounds scab over. He straightened, decades of military bearing reasserting themselves. I'm saying if you're forcing this into the open, I'm standing with you when you do. But you need more than just me. You need other voices, other witnesses, people Brennan can't dismiss as conspiracy between two people with personal grudges. I'm working on it. Work faster. You've got 4 days before that demonstration, and every person who supports you is a person at risk of retaliation. Brennan's already tightening control, watching everyone, making sure his people stay loyal through combination of incentive and threat. If he figures out who's talking to you before Friday, they'll back down or disappear. And you'll be standing alone in that cage with no one willing to confirm what everyone sees. He was right. She knew he was right. But rushing witness recruitment was how investigations got compromised, how word spread to targets who then had time to prepare defenses and coordinate stories. Caution had value even when urgency demanded speed. I'll be careful, she said. Careful's not enough when you're dealing with people who've already killed 3 times and gotten away with it. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, handed it to her. Names. 3 instructors who privately expressed concerns about the program to me over the past months. They won't go on record yet, too scared of retaliation and career destruction. But if you can get them to witness the demonstration, if they see something undeniable happen in real time, under official observation, they might find their courage. She unfolded the paper. 3 names written in precise block letters. Corporal Hayes, Staff Sergeant Martinez, Petty Officer Chen. 3 potential allies who were also 3 potential targets if Brennan discovered they were wavering. Thank you, Master Chief. Don't thank me, just don't die on Friday. He opened the door, paused with hand on the handle. My godson was 22 years old, had his whole life ahead of him, dreams about the future, plans for after his service, a girl he wanted to marry when his SEAL training was complete. I told him to trust the process, to respect the chain of command, to believe that hard training made strong warriors and that the system would protect him if he just worked hard and followed the rules. I was wrong, and I've spent 18 months living with that wrongness, with the knowledge that my advice killed him as surely as Brennan's hands did. He looked back at her. Don't make me live with yours too. Don't make me watch another person die because I didn't do enough to stop it. Then he was gone, and she was alone with 3 names in 4 days, and the growing certainty that this was all moving faster than she could control, that she'd set events in motion that would reach conclusion regardless of whether she was ready for them, that the only choice now was to ride the momentum and hope the outcome justified the risk. The next 3 days were a study in mounting tension that pervaded every interaction and made even routine activities feel charged with significance. Training instructors clustered in quiet conversations that stopped when she approached, words dying mid-sentence and faces going carefully neutral. Candidates trained harder than usual, pushed themselves further, sensing that something important was coming and trying to prove they belonged in its presence. The entire facility was recalibrating around this pending demonstration, treating it as event rather than routine, as confrontation rather than evaluation. Brennan ran drills with particular intensity during those 3 days, demonstrating techniques with clinical precision that somehow still managed to feel threatening despite being technically perfect. Every chokehold held exactly regulation time, released the instant someone tapped, textbook execution that couldn't be faulted by any objective measure. Every takedown controlled and safe, every submission applied with just enough pressure to demonstrate effectiveness without crossing into excess. He was showing her what control looked like when he chose to exercise it, implying that night drill had been different by choice rather than accident, that he could follow rules or break them as circumstances required and situations dictated. It was message and demonstration and threat wrapped into performance that looked like professional instruction to anyone who didn't understand the subtext. On Wednesday afternoon, she approached Corporal Hayes in the equipment cage during the maintenance window when people were dispersed and occupied with routine tasks. Found him alone, checking weights and calibrating tension on resistance machines, standard work that gave her cover for conversation that might look suspicious if observed. "Corporal, got a moment?" He looked up, expression guarded, immediate wariness in his eyes. "Ma'am, Master Chief Halverson gave me your name. Said you might have concerns about the training program, observations that don't match official documentation." His face went carefully neutral, all expression draining away like he'd pulled curtain over his thoughts. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am. I don't have concerns about anything. Training here is excellent, exactly what it should be." "I think you do know what I mean. I think you've seen things that don't match official policy, violations that happen when oversight isn't watching. I think you're smart enough to know the difference between hard training and abuse, between pushing limits and breaking people." She kept her voice low, conversational, like they were discussing equipment specifications rather than institutional corruption. "And I think you're scared to say anything because you know what happens to people who break ranks, who challenge authority, who make waves in systems designed to stay calm." He set down the wrench he'd been holding, glanced toward the door to make sure they were still alone. Even if that was true, what good would saying something do? People have complained before about excessive force and safety violations. Reports get filed. Investigations happen that don't investigate anything meaningful. Nothing changes except the people who complained end up transferred to terrible assignments or pushed out with career-ending performance reports. The system protects itself. That's because previous complaints didn't have enough evidence, didn't have comprehensive documentation from multiple sources, didn't have witnesses willing to stand together, so that dismissing them required dismissing everyone. She pulled out her tablet, showed him the encrypted file directory containing 18 months of accumulated evidence. I have witness statements, medical reports, maintenance logs showing equipment sabotage, video documentation of violations, including the chokehold from Nitro. What I need now are people willing to stand up on Friday and confirm what they've seen. People who will speak truth when it matters most. Stand up and paint targets on themselves, you mean? Stand up and destroy their careers for the satisfaction of maybe, possibly, getting some accountability that probably won't stick anyway, because the system always protects people like Brennan. Stand up and stop watching people die. Stop being complicit through silence. Stop letting good people get killed because everyone's too scared to acknowledge what everyone knows is happening. He flinched at that, the words hitting harder than she'd intended, but maybe harder than necessary to break through the fear that kept people silent. You're asking me to risk everything, my career, my reputation, possibly my physical safety. For what? So you can file a report that might get someone reprimanded, if you're lucky? Might get some policy changed that won't actually change anything? That's not justice. That's bureaucracy disguised as accountability. It's a start, and sometimes starts are all you get, all you can achieve in systems designed to resist change. He was quiet for a long time, internal calculation visible on his face like complex equation being worked through multiple variables. Fear warring with conscience. Self-preservation fighting the knowledge that silence was complicity, that doing nothing was choice just like doing something, that you couldn't avoid moral responsibility by pretending you weren't making decisions. Finally, he shook his head, expression pained. I'll be at the demonstration. I'll watch. But I'm not promising anything beyond that. I'm not committing to speaking up until I see what actually happens, until I know whether this is real attempt at accountability or just theater that will end with nothing changing. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't refusal either. Wasn't commitment, but wasn't rejection. She'd take it because it was more than she'd had before, because one maybe witness was better than no witnesses at all. Thursday brought escalation from a different direction, from the chain of command she'd been deliberately avoiding while building her case in isolation. She was reviewing files in her office when her tablet pinged with an encrypted message notification marked urgent and requiring immediate response. Emergency secure call required. Stand by for connection. This is not a request. The call came through 2 minutes later, audio only, voice on the other end belonging to someone she'd never met face-to-face, but who'd been coordinating her investigation from Washington, managing the political and bureaucratic aspects while she handled the ground-level evidence collection. Commander Voss, we have a significant problem that requires immediate attention. Sir, your demonstration tomorrow, the one you scheduled without authorization or consultation, it's drawing attention at levels above my authority, questions from people who can end investigations with single phone calls. People are asking why a routine compliance observer is calling out a decorated instructor for public evaluation. They're starting to wonder if there's more happening than standard oversight, if this facility is target of investigation they weren't informed about. Isn't that what we want, sir? Attention on the program? Pressure for accountability? Not before we have prosecutable evidence that will survive legal challenge and institutional resistance. Not before the case is airtight and comprehensive enough that dismissing it requires active participation in cover-up rather than passive acceptance of official narratives. The voice hardened, became command rather than explanation. Right now, all you have is documentation of training irregularities and some witness statements that can be explained away as personality conflicts or different interpretations of what constitutes appropriate pressure. You need something undeniable, something that can't be reframed or recontextualized. That's what tomorrow is for. Creating a situation where violations happen under full observation, where they're documented in real time by official systems that can't be dismissed as biased or unreliable. Or creating a situation where Brennan operates perfectly within regulations, under observation, and makes you look like an officer with a personal grudge pursuing a vendetta investigation, which destroys your credibility, ends any chance of prosecution, and probably ends your career. The voice took on edge she hadn't heard before. I'm ordering you to cancel the demonstration. Continue quiet documentation. Build the case properly through methods that don't alert targets or compromise investigation integrity. With respect, sir, the case is built. What we need now is to force it into the light where it can't be ignored or buried. Every day we wait is another day Brennan has to identify his vulnerabilities and shore them up. Commander, that's not a request or suggestion. That's a direct order from someone with authority over your investigation. Cancel the demonstration or I'll have you pulled from the facility immediately and replaced with someone who follows orders and understands chain of command. She closed her eyes, felt the weight of chain of command pressing down, the system trying to protect itself even when protection meant letting guilty people walk free and continuing patterns that had already killed 3 people. Michael's face flashed through her mind, young and eager and trusting that the system would protect him. David Halverson's face from the photographs in his file, smiling and confident in 3 weeks from completing a dream. James Mitchell and Aaron Torres, 2 more people who'd trusted the process and been betrayed by it. No, sir. Silence on the other end, stretching long enough that she wondered if the connection had failed. Then, quiet and dangerous. What did you say, Commander? I said no. The demonstration proceeds as scheduled. If you want to pull me from the facility, pull me. But do it after Friday, because I'm not backing down from this. I'm not letting 3 deaths become 4 or 5 or 6, because everyone's too careful to act, too worried about perfect cases to stop ongoing harm. Commander Voss, you are directly violating a direct order from superior authority in your chain of command. That's insubordination. That's career ending, regardless of how this investigation resolves. She ended the call, turned off the tablet, sat in the sudden silence of her office, knowing she just committed career suicide, that she'd burned her command relationship and probably her future in the Navy, and that none of it mattered if she could just get through the next 24 hours and force the truth into a space where it couldn't be ignored or dismissed or explained away through procedural objections. At 1400 Friday, she received final confirmation that the master terminal recording system was active and functioning properly, that backup systems were online in case primary systems failed, that multiple redundant documentation methods were in place. At 1430, the observation area started filling with personnel, more than required by mandatory attendance, word having spread that this was something worth witnessing. At 1445, she walked to the main training floor, clipboard in hand, expression neutral, letting nothing show of the calculation and fear and determination running through her mind like competing currents. The sparring ring had been cleared, mats fresh, chalk lines bright white against black rubber. The mobile command station sat in the corner, its screens glowing with multiple camera angles, 2 technical specialists in civilian clothes monitoring feeds. Official observers, brought in at her request through channels that bypass local command. People who wouldn't intervene, but who would document, and whose documentation would be harder to dismiss than internal reports that could be influenced by institutional loyalties and career considerations. Brennan arrived at 1455, full training gear, moving with the loose confidence of someone entering familiar territory where they knew every advantage and disadvantage. His eyes swept the observation area, cataloging who was present, who was watching, calculating the stakes and potential outcomes. When his gaze found her, he smiled with expression that carried more challenge than warmth. At 1600 exactly, she stepped to the center of the mat and addressed the assembled crowd in voice that carried to every corner without shouting, command presence that demanded attention without asking for it. This demonstration will simulate standard sparring responses under controlled oversight. Sergeant Brennan will lead, demonstrating proper technique and safety protocol compliance. I'll supervise and timestamp sequences. Recorders are live through Master Terminal with backup systems active. The purpose is to evaluate training effectiveness and safety protocol adherence. She turned to Brennan. Sergeant, when you're ready. He stretched his arms above his head, rolled his neck with audible pops, all performance for the watching crowd. Let's show them what real training looks like, what elite programs require, what it takes to forge warriors capable of operating in conditions where most people would break. The first 2 rounds were textbook perfect, demonstrating everything an evaluation board would want to see. He demonstrated takedowns and submissions with smooth efficiency that suggested thousands of repetitions, explaining each technique clearly, applying just enough pressure to show control without crossing into excess. His volunteer partner, a senior SEAL candidate who'd obviously been briefed on expectations, worked through the sequences professionally, tapping when appropriate, Brennan releasing immediately each time. Everything by regulation. Everything safe. Everything exactly aligned with official training doctrine. The crowd watched with growing confusion, tension that had been building all week deflating as people realized this wasn't the confrontation they'd been expecting. This was just standard instruction, professional and controlled and utterly unremarkable. Voss documented each sequence with her usual thoroughness, time-stamping movements, noting the precision and control, building the record that would show he could operate within regulations when motivated to do so, which made the times he didn't even more damning by demonstrating that violations were choices rather than accidents, were intentional rather than inevitable results of intense training environments. Then came round 3, and something shifted. Brennan's stance changed subtly. Weight distribution different. Energy level increasing in ways that were visible to anyone who knew how to read body language. The control remained, but underneath it was aggression, barely contained. Predatory focus that made his movements sharper and grips tighter, even while maintaining technical correctness. He demonstrated a rear choke on the volunteer, applying it with the same smooth efficiency he'd shown in previous rounds. Applied it professionally, maintained it for exactly 3 seconds while explaining mechanics to watching crowd, then released cleanly. Textbook demonstration that any instructor could be proud of. Now, he said to the watching crowd, voice carrying that particular combination of instruction and challenge. In actual combat conditions, your opponent doesn't tap politely and wait for you to release. They fight until they can't fight anymore. Training that doesn't prepare you for that reality is training that gets you killed when reality doesn't match expectations. He reset his position, looked directly at the crowd rather than at Voss. Let me show you the difference between demonstration for evaluation purposes and realistic pressure that prepares people for actual combat. Voss felt something cold slide down her spine, intuition screaming warning, even though nothing had happened yet that violated any regulation. She started to speak, to remind him that this was regulated demonstration, not combat simulation. That the purpose was evaluating technique rather than demonstrating intensity. But before she could form words, he'd move with speed that shocked everyone watching. The volunteer wasn't ready, hadn't been briefed that this transition was coming, tried to defend using the techniques he'd been taught, got swept and taken down hard, back hitting the mat with impact that drove air from his lungs in audible gasp. Before he could recover, Brennan's arm locked around his throat with technique that was still textbook, but force that exceeded demonstration parameters. Real pressure that cut blood flow immediately rather than gradually. The volunteer tapped once on Brennan's forearm. Immediate signal, clear and unmistakable to everyone watching, including the cameras capturing from multiple angles. Tapped with the kind of urgency that suggested genuine distress rather than polite submission. Brennan held. 4 seconds. 5. The volunteer's movements became desperate, not practiced technique, but genuine panic. Hands clawing at the forearm across his throat, body bucking, trying to escape position that was cutting off oxygen and blood flow to his brain. 6 seconds. 7. His face flushed dark red, eyes going wide with fear that was real rather than simulated, approaching the edge of unconsciousness that would leave him vulnerable to permanent injury if the hold continued. "Sergeant!" Voss's voice cut across the space, command tone that demanded immediate compliance and brooked no delay. "Release now." He held for one more second, making sure everyone understood this was his choice, not her command that determined when the hold ended, making sure his authority was established, even under conditions of official observation and evaluation. Then he let go, and the volunteer rolled away gasping, one hand on his throat, the other braced against the mat to keep himself upright, chest heaving as he tried to recover air and composure. The observation area was silent in a way that was different from previous silence. Not anticipation, but shocked recognition, understanding exactly what they just witnessed and what it meant. Not confusion about whether violation had occurred, but recognition that violation had been demonstrated under conditions that made denial impossible. "Sergeant Brennan," Voss said, her voice carrying to every corner of the facility with clarity that would be captured by every recording system. "You violated tap-out protocol. Duration between first submission signal and release was 8.2 seconds. Regulation maximum is immediate release, not to exceed 2 seconds for recognition delay under high-intensity conditions." He stood, casual and unbothered, expressions suggesting this was much ado about nothing. "Combat conditions don't wait for taps, Commander. I was demonstrating realistic pressure, showing people what they'll face when training becomes reality." "You were demonstrating unauthorized force during a regulated training evolution conducted under official evaluation protocols." She turned to the command station where the technical specialists were reviewing footage. "Replay footage with timestamp overlay. Display from first tap signal through release." The screens behind her lit up, camera angle showing perfect view of what had just occurred. The volunteer's hand striking Brennan's forearm in universal tap signal that anyone who'd received even basic training would recognize. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. The counter in the corner showing exact duration, measuring in tenths of seconds so that there could be no argument about timing. 8.2 seconds of maintained choke after clear submission had been signaled. The silence in the observation area deepened, heavy with implication that couldn't be dismissed or explained away as misunderstanding or different interpretation of acceptable training intensity. Then Voss pulled out her tablet, called up another file with movements that were deliberate and unhurried, making sure everyone saw what she was doing and understood what was coming next. For comparison and pattern establishment, here's footage from a voluntary night drill session that occurred 72 hours ago. The screen changed, image quality different because it was infrared from backup security camera rather than high definition from master terminal, but content unmistakable. Her body, his arm, the rear naked choke applied with similar force. Her hands tapping once, twice, 3 times with increasing desperation. Him holding 7.4 seconds past first signal before releasing. She looked directly at Brennan, no anger in her voice, just clinical precision that was more damning than emotion would have been. "This isn't training, Sergeant. This isn't preparing people for combat. This is assault conducted under color of authority. Pattern of unauthorized force applied repeatedly across multiple training environments with multiple victims." "It's conditioning," he said, voice still calm but edges showing now like cracks in facade that was beginning to crumble. "Making people understand that real combat doesn't give you time to signal surrender, that the enemy won't respect your taps, that if you can't handle pressure in training, you won't survive it in combat. And if an instructor can't respect submission signals that are fundamental to safe training, they don't belong in an instructor position, regardless of their combat credentials or decorations." She turned to address the observation area, including everyone present in what she was about to say. Master Chief Halverson, please step forward. Halverson moved from his position near the door, came to stand beside her with expression that was set like stone, but eyes holding something that might have been satisfaction or vindication or grief finally finding outlet after 18 months of being denied. His presence beside her was statement, was choosing sides, was making clear that this wasn't just her accusation, but was supported by someone with 40 years of credibility and respect. Master Chief, you provided me with documentation regarding 3 training fatalities that occurred at this facility over the past 18 months. Can you describe the common factors that connect these incidents? His voice was steady, formal, every word measured with precision that came from years of giving official testimony and knowing how important accuracy was when careers and prosecutions depended on what you said. All 3 deaths involved Sergeant Brennan as primary or supervising instructor. All 3 involved submission holds or stress conditions where safety protocols should have prevented lethality, but were either not followed or deliberately violated. All 3 were initially questioned by medical examiners in preliminary reports before final investigation reports ruled them accidental, with conclusions that contradicted clinical observations made immediately after death. Voss nodded, building the case in real time for everyone watching to hear and cameras to record. I've reviewed those original medical examiner reports, the preliminary versions before they were edited to align with institutional interests. Petty Officer David Halverson showed bruising patterns consistent with sustained choke pressure, well beyond recommended hold duration. Lance Corporal James Mitchell's injuries were disproportionate to described training intensity. Specialist Aaron Torres died under conditions where basic hydration and equipment protocols had been violated in ways that created entirely preventable, lethal circumstances. She looked around the observation area, making eye contact with people who'd been silent for 18 months. These deaths have a pattern. Today we witness that pattern demonstrated in real time, under official observation, with documentation that cannot be dismissed or explained away as misunderstanding. This is who Sergeant Brennan is when he believes he has authority that transcends regulation. This is what happens when institutional loyalty protects abusers rather than holding them accountable. Brennan's expression had hardened, mask of casual confidence cracking to reveal anger beneath. You're building a case on nothing, Commander. Training is inherently dangerous. People get hurt. Sometimes they die despite best efforts and proper protocols. That's the cost of forging excellence. If you can't accept that cost, you shouldn't be evaluating elite training programs. Excellence doesn't require killing people, Sergeant. Excellence requires discipline, control, knowing when to push and when to protect. She pulled up another file on her tablet. I also have witness statements from personnel who observed your training methods over the past 18 months. Personnel who were too scared to come forward until now. Movement in the observation area, people standing when remaining seated, became impossible. Corporal Jules stood first, followed by Staff Sergeant Martinez, both of them pale but resolute. Jules spoke first, voice shaky but determined. I witnessed Sergeant Brennan hold submissions past tap signals on 4 separate occasions during voluntary night drills over the past 6 months. I didn't report it at the time because I was explicitly told by senior instructors that questioning instructor methods was insubordination that would result in removal from the program. But I documented what I saw because I knew it was wrong. Martinez's voice was quieter, but carried clearly in the silence. I was present during the training evolution where Lance Corporal Mitchell sustained fatal injuries 8 months ago. The force used during that session was excessive beyond any reasonable interpretation of acceptable training intensity. The safety protocols that should have been in place were not followed. I was ordered by my chain of command to revise my witness statement to remove observations about excessive force and protocol violations. Then another voice from the back, Petty Officer Chen, speaking with quiet intensity, I have documentation of equipment maintenance irregularities that correlate with training accidents. Maintenance logs that were officially altered to remove evidence of unauthorized equipment modifications. Safety reports that disappeared from official files after being submitted through proper channels. I kept personal copies of original documentation. Brennan's control was cracking visibly now, facade of calm professionalism giving way to anger. This is coordinated conspiracy, organized attack from people with grudges in failing careers. You're listening to malcontents and incompetence instead of decorated combat veterans who've proven themselves under actual fire. I'm listening to evidence, Voss cut him off with precision that left no room for response. Multiple witnesses providing corroborating testimony, documentation from independent sources showing consistent patterns, video proof of violations captured under official observation, medical reports that contradict official narratives, maintenance logs showing systematic safety failures, a pattern 18 months long and 3 bodies deep that can no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. She turned to the command station observers. This facility requires immediate external oversight intervention and comprehensive formal investigation of all training-related fatalities and injuries. Current local command has demonstrated inability or unwillingness to maintain accountability. The senior observer stood, expression grave. Agreed. Based on what we've witnessed and documented here today, immediate intervention is warranted and necessary. This demonstration is concluded. Sergeant Brennan, you are placed on immediate administrative hold pending formal inquiry. You will surrender your instructor credentials, vacate this facility, and make yourself available for official investigation. You are not to contact any personnel currently assigned to this facility or attempt to influence any aspect of the investigation that will follow. For a moment that stretched too long, it looked like Brennan might refuse. His hands flexed. His jaw tightened until muscles stood out beneath skin. Every muscle telegraphed the decision happening behind his eyes. Then Master Chief Halverson stepped forward, positioning himself between Brennan and Voss, and spoke with quiet authority. It's over, son. Done. Finished. Walk away with what dignity you have left, because fighting now just makes everything worse and doesn't change outcome that's already determined. Brennan looked at him, then at Voss, then at the observation area full of people who'd been loyal until loyalty became complicity. His kingdom was collapsing. He turned and walked toward the exit without speaking, footsteps heavy and angry, but controlled. Stopped at the door, looked back one final time with expression that carried threat, even in defeat. This facility will fall apart without proper structure, without discipline, without someone willing to do what's necessary to forge real warriors instead of pretenders. No, Voss said clearly, voice carrying to every corner and every recording device. It will rebuild, with discipline that doesn't require bodies, with structure that protects instead of destroys, with leadership that knows the difference between forging excellence and breaking people. He left without responding, and the door closed behind him with finality that felt like ending and beginning simultaneously. The observation area erupted in noise that had been suppressed for too long. Halverson turned to Voss with expression that was a complicated mix of satisfaction and exhaustion in something that might have been hope. It's not over. He's got allies in the command structure, people who'll want to protect him because exposing him exposes their own failures of oversight. The system will try to minimize this, contain the damage. The system just watched him violate regulations under full observation with official documentation, watched multiple witnesses come forward, watched evidence presented that cannot be explained away. The system protects itself, but right now protecting Brennan means accepting liability for 3 deaths and however many other incidents will uncover. You think they'll actually prosecute? You think this will lead to real accountability? I think they won't have a choice. Not anymore. Not after today. The formal investigation took 6 weeks of intensive work, involving interviews with 43 personnel, review of hundreds of documents, analysis of dozens of hours of video footage. The Inspector General's final report was damning. 3 training deaths at Combat Training Annex showed clear patterns of negligence rising to level of criminal misconduct. Sergeant Garrett Brennan had repeatedly violated safety protocols, ignored submission signals, created culture where abuse was normalized and questioning was punished. Facility Commander Colonel Reeves had received and dismissed multiple complaints, had altered witness statements to protect institutional reputation, had pressured medical examiners to modify preliminary findings. Both men faced court-martial proceedings. Brennan was charged with 3 counts of negligent homicide, multiple counts of assault under color of authority, destruction of evidence, and conduct unbecoming. Reeves was charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice, falsifying official documents, failure to maintain command discipline, and dereliction of duty, resulting in preventable deaths. 4 other instructors received administrative separations. The Combat Training Annex was placed under new leadership selected specifically for commitment to reform. Revised protocols were implemented bearing formal designation Morrison Safety Standards, named after Michael Voss, whose death at Fort Benning 5 years earlier had started Ilara on path that led to this facility in this investigation. The standards established mandatory independent observation of high-risk training, prohibited voluntary sessions that operated outside official oversight, required immediate medical evaluation for any training injuries, and created anonymous reporting mechanisms. The court-martial proceedings took 4 months of testimony and evidence presentation. Brennan's defense argued that training elite warriors required hard decisions, that deaths were tragic but inevitable byproduct of preparing people for combat. The prosecution countered with video evidence showing violations, witness testimony establishing patterns, medical reports demonstrating injuries inconsistent with acceptable training parameters, and simple, undeniable truth that real warriors knew when to release chokes, that competent instructors could push limits without killing people. The verdict came down on a Thursday in February when California rain was making everything gray and wet. Guilty on all counts for both men. Brennan was sentenced to 12 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all benefits and decorations. Reeves received 8 years, similar discharge conditions, permanent prohibition from serving in any military or government capacity. The sentences were longer than typical because the court found that abuse of authority and systematic cover-up warranted enhanced penalties. Master Chief Duncan Halverson retired 2 weeks after the verdict, 68 years old with 43 years of service, finally able to leave knowing that his godson's death hadn't been meaningless. At his retirement ceremony, attended by fewer people than should have been present because institutional memory preferred forgetting over acknowledging failure, he said only 5 words that captured everything important. David didn't die for nothing. Lieutenant Commander Ilara Voss was promoted to commander and given command of the reformed Combat Training Annex with explicit mandate to rebuild culture from foundation up. The promotion came with official accommodation for exceptional performance and courage under adverse conditions. But everyone understood it was also acknowledgement that the Navy needed her in that specific position. On her first day back at the facility in her new role, she stood in the main training area watching a new class of candidates run through drills under revised safety protocols. Protective gear was mandatory for all sparring. Safety monitors were present for every high-risk evolution, with authority to stop training immediately if protocols were violated. Submission signals were respected immediately, without exception, and any hold maintained past 2 seconds triggered automatic review. Every wall in the facility now held plaques listing 3 names in letters large enough to read from anywhere in the space. David Michael Halverson, James Patrick Mitchell, Aaron Carlos Torres. The dead who had finally gotten recognition, whose deaths had finally meant something beyond tragedy. Master Chief Halverson attended that first day, even though he was no longer in uniform, present as civilian advisor. He stood beside her on the mezzanine overlooking the training floor, watching candidates work through drills, and after long silence spoke quietly. "You think it'll last? The reforms? The commitment to doing this right? As long as people remember why they matter, as long as we keep the names on the walls and tell the stories, and refuse to let institutional memory erase what happened here. And when new leadership comes in, when memory fades and pressure builds to return to old methods because they're familiar and comfortable." She looked at him with expression that was determined without being naive. "Then we fight again. Because that's what this is, Master Chief. Not a victory that's permanent and complete, just a battle won in ongoing war to keep training from becoming killing. The work doesn't end, it just evolves." He nodded slowly, understanding the reality even if he wished it were different. "I'm too old for wars that don't end." "No, you're not. You're exactly the right age to understand they're worth fighting, even when winning is temporary and requires constant effort." Below them on the training floor, a candidate tapped during submission drill, signal clear and immediate. The instructor released instantly, helped the candidate to his feet, offered quiet correction. Professional instruction. Safe methodology. Exactly what training was supposed to look like when people running it valued lives more than reputations. It was small moment, nothing dramatic or noteworthy in isolation, just one person respecting another's limits and choosing protection over domination. But small moments accumulated over time, built culture, created the difference between programs that forged genuine excellence and programs that ground people down until something broke and someone died. The California sun was setting through the high windows, painting the facility in amber light. And for the first time since she'd walked through the annex doors months ago, the air felt lighter somehow, felt less oppressive, felt like space where people could train hard and push limits without fearing that pushing would become breaking, and breaking would become dying. Not because the work was finished, because it had finally, truly, properly begun with foundations solid enough to support the structure that needed to be built, with commitment deep enough to resist erosion from institutional pressure, with memory clear enough to prevent repetition of failures that had cost 3 lives before being acknowledged and addressed. "What's next, ma'am? We train people right. We respect their limits. We build warriors who protect instead of prey on vulnerability. And we make sure that anyone who walks into this facility walks out alive and better than they were when they entered." She looked at him with expression that acknowledged the difficulty without being deterred by it. "Sound achievable? Sounds like a career's worth of work. Sounds like something that will require constant effort and vigilance." "Good, then we better get started, because the work won't do itself, and the standards won't maintain themselves." They stood together, watching the training continue below. Two people who'd fought institutional inertia and barely won, who understood that winning was temporary and required constant defense, who accepted that burden because someone had to carry it, and they were the ones who'd proven they could and would, regardless of cost. The cage had rules now, real ones, enforced ones, rules that were actually followed rather than selectively applied. And the people inside that cage were safer because someone had decided that safety mattered more than comfort, that justice mattered more than career, that 3 lives lost were 3 too many, and preventing the 4th was worth any risk. It wasn't perfect victory. Perfect victories didn't exist in complex systems with competing interests. But it was accountability, which was often the best that justice could offer in environments where power protected power, and challenging authority required more courage than most people possessed. The training continued as afternoon turned to evening. The facility rebuilt itself around new standards and new leadership. The names on the wall stood witness to the cost of failure and the price of success. And Commander Elara Voss kept her promise to dead men who couldn't speak for themselves anymore, ensuring their deaths meant something beyond tragedy, beyond statistics, beyond paperwork filed and then forgotten. She made sure they were remembered, their stories told, their sacrifice meaningful. And in a training facility in California, where the sun set golden over the Pacific, and candidates pushed themselves to their limits under proper supervision, where submission signals were respected and safety was paramount, 3 names remained on the walls as permanent reminder of why all of this mattered and what happened when it didn't. That was justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real. That was accountability, hard-won and requiring constant defense, but achieved. That was the difference one person could make when they refused to accept that institutional failure was inevitable. The old guard evolved, the system reformed, the names remembered, and the work continued, because that's what those who survived owed to those who didn't.